Hello YouTubers out there, this is Jerry Saravia at the movies. So today we're talking about the 40th anniversary of Blade Runner, which was this past June, and my feelings on it. Now, Blade Runner is one of those films that I practically grew up with for 40 years. This is a film I've revisited quite often, and I love every shot in this movie, every scene, every line of dialogue. And depending on which version you like, of which there are at least 3 or 4 in existence, if not more, believe it or not, everything in these films works, no matter which version it is. My preference might be for the 1982 theatrical version, which had the voiceover narration by Harrison Ford playing Rick Deckard. This basically a detective of the future, 2019, which was the future, now is no longer the future anymore. And what fascinates me about Blade Runner is that although it deals with emotions that are kept at a remove or at a distance, it's a very emotionally distant film technically, but really the film does resonate with you. The emotions are there. And even if they seem to be on the surface, they can register. After 1 or 2 viewings, you certainly can really get the gist of what it is that director Ridley Scott was trying to aim for, based, of course, on the novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. So, now, backtracking a little bit, the 1982 theatrical version was not the first version I have seen of Blade Runner. I actually saw the international version, which was shown on cable and much later on VHS, which is an exceedingly violent vision of the 2019 future, far more violent than the theatrical version. So although I didn't get to see this in theaters, and at that point I became a huge Harrison Ford fan, even before Blade Runner. Really, I didn't know too much of him other than Han Solo. But once I saw Raiders of the Lost Ark, which was released the year prior to Blade Runner, I became a full-fledged Harrison Ford fan. So, anyway, the film itself is, of course, set in 2019. So, I guess what I was trying to say before was that the version I saw is the version I usually associate with Blade Runner, because it's the one I kind of pretty much grew up with the voiceover narration. So before I get to description of 2019 future, in 1992, the director's cut by by Ridley Scott was released in theaters, and that was my first and only real chance to see that film in theaters. And it was a full house. I remember I saw it actually when I was living in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and what a treat to see this movie in a big screen, the way it was really meant to be seen. And so, I don't know where I was going with that. But anyhow, so Blade Runner is just something I just watched repeatedly. It was one of those films that a next-door neighbor had recorded on HBO and on tape, and VHS tape in those days. That's how it was. And I would watch it repeatedly. It was just something that it was so uniquely different from any other film about science fiction, although this film deals with science fiction to a certain extent. It's not really a science fiction movie per se. It's still set in planet Earth, but it still deals with a future that never, well, we haven't exactly gotten the future that film showed, to some degree. But it's just something I would watch repeatedly. It's just one of those movies that was so different from anything else I'd seen. And I guess you could say it was really one of the first adult films I watched repeatedly. It's Blade Runner, very much a rated R movie in every sense of the word. So the future depicted in this film is a vaguely dystopian future, but it's also a grim, despondent one. So this is one where humankind is almost irrelevant. And there is no big brother watching, as is true with most dystopias. If it does exist, a big brother in Blade Runner, it exists in the framework of its futuristic setting. But it never really emerges, unlike, say, 1984 by George Orwell, and of course the film which came out in 1984, or THX 1138 by George Lucas, which is a far more grim film than this one, or Brazil by Terry Gilliam. So, now the the story of this film is that there are replicants, so they are more human than human. This is the motto by the Tyrell Corporation that has designed these replicants. And they created them, but only with a 4-year lifespan. So almost basically they're androids to some degree. And some of them had been fighting a war in the off-world colony, which is really outside of Earth. And it was illegal for them to come back, I believe is sort of the idea of it. And but the replicants who are illegal on Earth and have the 4-year lifespan are just as irrelevant as the humans. So really, when you watch Blade Runner, you get the impression through most of the early scenes of the picture, really throughout the whole movie, that nobody really seems to care, and everyone marches to their own drum. It's just that kind of movie. And it's always raining, and it's always nighttime, which is an interesting choice. And of course, that became just as influential as the special effects in the picture. I don't think that without that vision, that look, you would have had the film of The Crow the way it looks, and various other films that have tried to copy Blade Runner. Definitely very influential. So, in terms of the look, it's a rainy city, overwhelmed. It's Los Angeles, by the way, and it's overwhelmed by cables and technology and lots of neon signs. And everything is just sheerly amazing to watch. Every shot has such visual punch. You really feel, but not even just that. You really feel you're there. It's very immersive. There are the busy streets. They are dirty, grimy, trashy. The city of LA is overpopulated, which probably is still the case today, I'm sure. And not many can be bothered by someone shooting a female replicant in the back, which happens to Zora, who was of course played in the film by Joanna Cassidy, who was shot by the Blade Runner, Rick Deckard. And then there's the stunning introduction of Pris, played by Daryl Hannah, a replicant and pleasure model type who can do backflips. And as she walks through the LA streets near the Bradbury Building, which is showing newspapers and trash flying about, old antique cars drive by amidst the flying police cars, which are the only cars that fly, are the police cars in the film, the spinners as they're called. They seem to be, they're flying about, but everyone is driving antique cars or old cars. It's really interesting. And you see a lot of that kind of mix of nostalgia and different eras in even Tim Burton's Batman. So a lot of the characters, they wear 40s style clothing. Some wear red blinking sunglasses and chic fashion accessories and lots of fishnets. And the police detective in Blade Runner, Rick Deckard, wears a dirty brown trench coat that would seem strange in a 1940s noir tale. His apartment is also littered with papers on the floor, and somehow it's overstuffed. And he loves Chinese food, but he keeps to himself until he's required to hunt down and kill the replicants. And his boss is Chief Bryant, played by M. Emmett Walsh, one of the best character actors on Earth, who's still working to this day, by the way. So he has to kill these replicants who have escaped from the off-world colony. This is a place of opportunity and adventure where replicants worked as slaves, but something happened, and there was either some kind of a war or violence broke out, let's put it that way. So, but nobody wants this job to track down these replicants and kill them, and not even Deckard. Now, my father at the time, who became a fan of Blade Runner later on, as is the case of a lot of people I know, who didn't quite care for the film the first time they saw it, but then later seemed to become fans. In fact, the film, according to the documentary, kind of became a cult favorite not long after it disappeared from theaters, which is very interesting. It became like a midnight show thing, and very quickly. Usually, something that becomes a cult film becomes one. Not usually that quickly. I can't really say for sure about past cult films like, say, Harold and Maude or El Topo, but usually those play very well at the time in the early 70s with college towns, and then eventually migrated to midnight cult film status. But I think a lot of these pictures, it took a little time before that really occurred, becoming a midnight staple. But Blade Runner, it was almost quick. It just started to happen almost immediately. Now, my father felt initially that it was a very thin plot. that could be made into a half-hour movie. I sort of understand what he was getting at, but this movie is too extraordinarily dense and packed with visual details and suppressed emotions to only last half an hour. It is too serenely beautiful in its look of a city where it is always nighttime and raining cats and dogs, and the film is best experienced as a poetic dream of a world that never existed. And so that even though Blade Runner examines emotionally bankrupt humans like Deckard and how they stand in contrast with replicants' own emotional responses, it really is the replicants whose emotions threaten to explode. They are sadness, tears, and savage violence. They just have a little bit of everything, these replicants. And the replicant that Deckard identifies via what they call a Voight-Kampff test is Rachel, the glamorous 40s type played by Sean Young, who looks like a brunette version of Barbara Stanwyck in Dublin Indemnity. And she's aware she's been identified and confronts Deckard with her childhood photos. Now, you see, that's the other aspect to the replicants. They are implanted with these images, photos of families that they never actually belonged to. And this is where their emotional response comes from. Deckard is very plain with her and tells her those are implants, someone else's memories. And the scene hits you like a ton of bricks because Rachel knows it is the truth and can't bear it. And Dr. Terrell, as played by the late Joe Turkel, designed and created these replicants, and in the case of Rachel, gave her these memory implants, is what they're called, that belonged to his nieces. Exactly why this scientist and a corporate entity himself did this is never quite explained in the film. But there's a lot of sadness and regret in Blade Runner. And only the replicants are more in touch with their emotions than the humans. Now that's really nothing new, but it's definitely done in such a way that you can't help but feel for them. Because the humans don't, like I said, most of the scenes of crowd scenes, everyone's just marching to their own drums. Kind of like living in New York City. It's the exact same thing. They're marching to their own drum. They're not there to notice or, break away or notice something that's going on. They just, whatever's going on, they're single-mindedly doing whatever it is they're doing, reaching their own destination. Then there's the character of Gaff, played by Edward James Olmos, another cop who resents Deckard and merely smiles at Deckard, though he speaks what's called city speak, which sounds like gibberish and some sort of lingo that only LA cops know. But even then, this character is still kind of at a remove. And Deckard, though, seems to live a solitary life of drinking. A lot of drinking, playing the piano while watching the spinners make their way through the concrete jungle. That includes ads for Atari and RCA, two brands which I think for the most part don't even exist anymore. Certainly Atari doesn't. Although Atari shows up again in Blade Runner 2049, so I don't know what to say about that. Now, according to Ridley Scott, Deckard is a replicant, and the director's cut of the film and the final cut, which came out in 2007, show an image of a unicorn that looks like it emerged from Scott's film Legend, although it didn't. Now, the amazing image, as it is, it's hard to say if that really proves much of anything, other than the connection to Gaff's origami paper figures, which includes a unicorn, as if Gaff is aware and trying to, it's a symbol. I could sort of understand that, but I remember even my philosophy teacher back in Queens College, when I attended there back in 1990, the film was screened then. This is before I saw a director's cut. So technically I saw it again in an actual film print, a 35 millimeter film print. I think it was 35, if not 16. And I've forgotten about that. But anyway, he said that Deckard is more likely a replicant because no one else but Deckard seems to be able to deal with these replicants. Well, that doesn't prove anything. To me, I'm not sure he is a replicant at all. But that's just my thought on it. But what I do think is that Deckard is an emotionally empty man. And you see, the replicants are attuned to their emotions. Deckard doesn't seem to be. And I think that, to me, is the difference. There's no emotional scene, really, for Harrison Ford in this movie. He is emotionally mute. Probably part of the reason why he didn't like playing it, I'm sure. And this is where the disagreements started between him and kind of legendary now between him and director Ridley Scott. It was, I think it's a film he appreciates. I'm just not sure that he likes his character in it. It's not something Harrison Ford usually does, which is to play a character of reserved emotions, or of any emotions at all. So that's not really something Harrison Ford is. Always an explosive actor. I think he's very underrated and usually does his best, is at his best when he's very colorful and brings up his vulnerability and shows that in great strokes. You know, he looks like the kind of person. At the time, it was, I remember one critic said he's everybody's favorite punching bag, and this is true. He shows such vulnerability, so he can be the hero, but and you still kind of root for him in most of his best films. But in Blade Runner, I don't know how many people really rooted for Deckard. And it's an interesting choice. So you still care about the character, but are you rooting for him as much as you're rooting for Batty, played by Rutger Hauer, who is fabulous in the film. In fact, his Tears in the Rain dialogue at the end of that movie is just so emotional, so beautiful. There's really nothing better when it comes to seeing a replicant or an android express their feelings about living on Earth and knowing that they're about to die. So, nonetheless, I think that Harrison Ford plays a man who's good at what he does, yet we don't celebrate him as a hero for killing the replicants. And that's an interesting thing. It's not like I don't remember even when it was screened, when I saw it with an audience twice, that anybody was really, oh yeah, shoot him. You know, it wasn't like that. And Deckard himself genuinely feels bad for them. And any level of heroism for his actions seem mute. So it's an interesting choice, but it doesn't make him a replicant. So I don't really believe that. And as I mentioned, the final astounding sequence with the formidable Batty, who actually not just confronts Deckard, and you think he's probably going to kill him, but he saves Deckard's life, even though he knew Deckard killed Pris. And Pris is killed with one bloody gunshot after another, and he kind of, finds her body, Batty that is, and the blood is on his fingers, and he puts it on his face. It's really kind of like a savage animal, but a hurt, wounded animal in a way. And then he starts howling. It's really fascinating stuff. I mean, that character was really, you don't... This is why I said, when it comes to really great films about the future, since Blade Runner, the only other one that really... There might be some others, but the one that really rises to the occasion is Dark City, for me, which I would like to review someday. I never actually wrote a review for it, but I would like to. It's still a film I think about tremendously. I think that is a very great film, and I have both versions, so I'll have to see both to really talk about multiple versions. There are two versions of Dark City, but I got both of them. But that's the one that comes closest to the pain and the power of Blade Runner. And that to me is what I take away from it. So, well, as I said, those moments will be lost in time like tears in rain, time to die. Batty's last words. And Rutger Hauer did a tremendous job there. And you shed a tear for Batty, and we could see Deckard feels it too. So the replicants care about their existence and have emotions and memories they cling to. They want to be human, and don't seem to notice that humans have forgotten how to feel. So it's an interesting dynamic in this movie. The replicants don't realize that the humans, they kind of take their emotions for granted. Not that this is ever actually said or spoken, but it's implied. That's what makes great screenwriting, is when you imply just as much as you say. This is what you can take away from it. At least that's my interpretation. So for me, Blade Runner is fantastic. It's astoundingly immersive filmmaking. It pretty much influenced everything dystopian and cyberpunkish that came after it. So really without it, you couldn't even have a movie I don't care for at all, The Matrix. But I think Dark City might be the most... I don't know if it's the most reflective of what Blade Runner did. Certainly The Crow, though The Crow, is an entirely different kind of movie in many ways. But that's just it. Blade Runner is so unique in tone and style, and so powerfully rendered, that to me it stands tall as one of the greatest films that deals with science fiction elements ever made. So for me, there was Metropolis. It was followed by 2001: A Space Odyssey, and then Blade Runner. Then after that, I guess Dark City. I'll have to reevaluate that, and I think that will be a later episode on this channel at some point. I'll have to really examine Dark City again. I've seen it a few times, but now there was, I'll briefly mention a sequel, Blade Runner 2049, and it's a movie that I've watched twice. The first time I wasn't exactly sure how to feel. I thought it was way too long. Blade Runner just runs about 2 hours, maybe 2 hours and a few minutes, depending which version you see. As I said, I think I have a preference for the 1982 theatrical version. But then again, the international version with its extra bits of violence, which I don't always necessarily condone. Something bloodier doesn't make it better, but somehow in that film it does. But then it doesn't. I don't know. It's hard to say. I can't make a preference, but I think the voiceover narration for me reminded me of film noir at its best, at its most fatalistic. And it really helps the film. I disagree with people that didn't like the narration, that it was tacked on. It seems to me that, especially since it's being said by Harrison Ford, we're kind of inside of his head. That's the impression I get, from the movie, even though there are scenes that don't include Deckard. But the sequel for me just fell very short of what the original film did, and it's only because it just feels to me like it didn't need a sequel. And there's even an anime series, and I think I saw the first episode, which wasn't bad. I may watch the rest of it, but it's just, sometimes you have to leave something alone. They never made a sequel to Metropolis. Why would you? What could you possibly do? That movie says it's too epic. It did everything. Of course, there was a sequel to 2001: A Space Odyssey, which wasn't anywhere near what Kubrick did in his original. And then it was another sequel called 2061, I think, by Arthur C. Clarke, which was never made into a movie. I doubt they ever will. I've never read it, so I can't comment on what that's all about. But the sequel just didn't come anywhere near what the original film did. Really, Rick Deckard had too small a role. The central character wasn't nearly as interesting, and he is a replicant, and a Blade Runner. So, they just decided to go all the way with that concept. Whereas in the original, you're not really sure, but I don't think he's a replicant. But those are my thoughts. So tell me what you think out there in YouTube land, what you think about Blade Runner. To me, it definitely stands the test of time. I think it's a timeless picture. They got the future a little bit wrong in certain aspects. Of course, Atari's not really around anymore. And everyone uses cell phones. They don't use picture phones that are off on the street somewhere. Which was really interesting, that you have to dial it in, and then you see a picture of somebody on the tube. It's interesting that, well, of course we don't have flying police cars, or flying cars for that matter. Not really. Some have been invented, but they're not in practical use, that's for sure. But a lot of things in that film still seem like if it could come from the 1940s. So that's interesting, other than the design of replicants, which we haven't reached quite the stage that they have in that movie. And it's weird now, knowing that I saw the film in 1983, thinking 2019 is so far away, and now we're 3 years in after 2019. How weird. But tell me your thoughts on Blade Runner. What did you think about it? If you agree with my thoughts, or if you see other aspects to the film that I missed, I'd be glad to hear it, because everyone has a different opinion. This movie resonates on very deep levels, and emotional ones too. So I'd love to hear your comments out there. And if you like what you hear, please subscribe to my channel. And this is Jerry Saravia at the Movies, signing off.